I thought what I would do is just maybe take about 25 minutes or 30 minutes and kind of give an overview of what the book does. And so I wanted to basically talk a little bit about the content of the book, the aims of the book, and then a couple of just sort of conclusions at the end of it that are essentially kind of broader, thinking about it more broadly. Right? So I'm a historian, and that's important to know because the topic is sort of timely, but my interest tends to be sort of more historical, but I don't want to sort of more contemporary relevance. But basically, so it's a history of libertarian exit. That's the subtitle, A History of Libertarian Exit. This piece of art, by the way, is a friend of mine did this, Stiller Sussman. She's a wonderful artist. It's a big piece I have in my house that she did for my partner and I. Anyway, so it was nice to include that. It's very archipelagic, which goes with the theme of the book. But a couple of things about libertarian exit that I'll just say very quickly. I want to say, first of all, what I mean by libertarian is not anarchist. I mean, that should probably be, go without saying. But I'm really interested in this book in people who, some of them call themselves anarchists. If you're watching this HBO show now, The Anarchists, or, anarcho-capitalists, not a term in my opinion, but anyways, there's very hyper-capitalist libertarians who go to this annual conference and they call themselves anarchists. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about individuals who are hyper-capitalist. They are radical individualists. They are driven by an idea that property rights and the market are the sort of mechanisms through which one achieves freedom, and similar kinds of things. They have a strong position about the state, and that position is basically that the state should be a sort of ultra-minimalist entity. And what they mean by that is not that the state should be stripped away of its finances. Right? They're really, what they're talking about when they talk about a minimal state is the range of the functions that the state fulfills, not how much money it has or how big its presence is in your life. Right? So their position is, in general, there's variations in this, but their position generally would be military for national defense, a police force to protect you from direct forms of violence, and a judiciary and a patent office to protect you from fraud and breach of contract. That's basically the state they want to see. Those are the functions of the state. Anything outside of that is outside the realm of the state. But it's not a manifesto for a small state. National defense, police, judiciaries cost an enormous amount of money. Right? So it's not about its size. Their main influences intellectually are probably familiar to some of you. Milton Friedman, Hayek, right, the Austrian school of what becomes neoliberal economics. In philosophy, someone like Robert Nozick, who was writing in the 1970s in response to theories of liberalism. But the core people that influence them and the people that they reference the most frequently are von Mises and Ayn Rand. And I think it's important to stress this because Rand and Mises have a very sort of flat, unnuanced kind of vision of the ultra-minimalist state. Hayek and Friedman, for all their failings and their desire to defend their philosophy or their sort of economic principles, but they had a kind of nuance to them. And Mises and Rand were much more sort of polemical and direct about their positions. And so these were the sort of thinkers who were influencing the individuals I look at, and especially Rand, who's both sort of a philosopher, but also primarily a novelist. And it's her novels that proved very influential. So that's what I mean by libertarian. What I mean by exit is these are individuals who want to leave the nation state. They want to leave the nation state not as an expat. They're not interested, in going to Tokyo and hanging out as an expat, like Lost in Tokyo, whatever that movie was called. It's not about being an expat. It's about actually leaving the nation state form as you know it, creating a new country, and creating a new country that has a slightly different kind of state structure to it. And that state structure would essentially be, it would be a sovereign entity, it would be a territorial entity, and it would be an entity that would be run almost entirely through the libertarian principles that I've just laid out for you. So it would be almost entirely transactional. You could buy in as a settler, or you can invest as an investor, but you would essentially sign up for a series of make contracts, or everything would be contractual in some form. How much leverage or leeway you had vis-a-vis, financing national defense or financing policing is one of the things that gets worked out in these contracts. So that's the idea behind exit. It's not expatriation, it's actually leaving in some sense and creating a new nation state, or a new state in some form. It's not about tax avoidance only. I mean, obviously that's a big part of it. It's great to kind of go and feel like you don't have to pay taxes and so forth. It's not solely about setting up special economic zones. That's also part of this. They do want to set up things that look a little bit like a nostalgic vision of Hong Kong, right? This is often the sort of reference point that they'll make. But for many of them, it's also what they call a moral experiment. And they see this as a kind of path to freedom in some form. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. So libertarian and exit is the kind of basic framing of it. And then what I do over the course of 6 chapters is I looked at historical precedents. You could go a long ways back. You could look at the company states as a form of privatized sovereignty. There's a whole array of things you could look at: private contract and the colonization of Africa in the 19th century, Wakefield's experiments in New Zealand in the same time period. But I decided to start basically post-World War II and move forward, because this was when you see the sort of self-conscious appropriation of the idea of being a libertarian, a market libertarian in this fashion, sort of come to the fore as a way to challenge the New Deal of Roosevelt and the like. So I started in the 1950s, and I looked at a group of individuals, especially one man by the name of Michael Oliver. Michael Oliver is still alive. He was born Moses Elitsky in Lithuania, in Kaunas, in 1928. He was the only person in his family to survive the Holocaust. His mother or his sister was captured and deported by Soviet troops, and then when the Nazis occupied Lithuania, his entire family was killed. He was the only survivor. He was in a concentration camp in Poland and then rescued by Japanese American troops after World War II, spent 2 years in a displaced persons camp, came to the United States to Nevada, and over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s, made pretty substantial money. He was a land developer, and also he owned a coin shop, metals, so silver, gold, and the like. He published in 1968, so over the course of the 1960s, he became very fearful of sort of what he was seeing. He was understandably worried about totalitarianism, given his own personal experience. And over the course of the 1960s, he became concerned about what he saw as a kind of totalitarian turn in the United States, and decided that exit was the sort of solution to this, right? To sort of leave and create a new country. Interestingly enough, when he looked around him, he didn't see totalitarianism in the KKK or the white Christian nationalists or the John Birch Society, which is the sort of the sort of Trumpists of the 1960s, or is the sort of right-wing reactionary world of the 1960s in the United States. He saw it in the civil rights movement. He saw it in second-wave feminism. He saw it in rights for LGBTQ populations. And so he sort of oriented his attention towards social movements that themselves were looking for emancipation and practicing emancipatory politics. This is not uncommon in the 1960s. A lot of the people that I look at who find themselves as libertarian ended up, while they're espousing a certain kind of notion of freedom, ended up, in some sense, allying themselves with some of the most reactionary elements in the country. A lot of it because of the property rights arguments that were being developed. And property rights was used as a way to speak about race in the era of civil rights in a way where you hoped you wouldn't be called a racist. And so property rights was used as a mechanism, in some sense, to continue a form of white supremacy in the United States in the 1960s. And so there's the property rights question, amongst others, that there's sort of Barry Goldwater's candidacy in the 1960s as well, that put a lot of this stuff sort of out in the open. So Oliver decides he wants to leave. In 1968, he writes a little book called A New Constitution for a New Country. self-publishes it in February of 1968, sells out immediately, republishes it, a second edition, doubles the price, and that sells out in May of 1968. So 1968 is interesting because it's often associated with the New Left, the rise of sort of the New Left in the United States, Age of Aquarius, so on and so forth. But it's also the kind of age of Atlantis. I mean, Atlantis is the kind of touchstone for libertarians at the time. And there's a huge libertarian eruption in the 1960s as well. And so Oliver writes this book, and a lot of people who buy it are people of means. I can give you a few examples here very quickly. Willard Garvey, who was a wheat magnate from Wichita Falls, Kansas. He also ran a company called World Homes Incorporated, which built low-income housing, private low-income housing in places like Peru and elsewhere. Garvey had a direct link to the head of the CIA, the two brothers, the Foster Dulles brothers, who were, one was head of United Fruit, and the other was head of the CIA for a while. Garvey had a direct link to him and wrote him a letter in which he said, in response to the claim, every man a communist, this was the sort of statement coming out of the Soviet Union, he said, every man a capitalist, and the way to make every man a capitalist is home ownership. And so Garvey was very wealthy, very prominent, very important, and he read Oliver's stuff and got very excited. And he got a group of his fellow wealthy friends involved. John Templeton from the Templeton Foundation, very important investor on Wall Street. If you listen to NPR, you'll hear them talk about the Templeton Foundation backing NPR. That's Del Templeton. And a host of other people who I won't go into detail about. With this support, Oliver set up what was called the Ocean Life Research Foundation. And so what he was trying to do here was figure out, if you're going to exit, where can you go? On a planet where, in theory, most territory has been divided up into sovereign nation states, where can you go? And so he did what a lot of people did in the 1960s, including Ernest Hemingway's brother, younger brother, Lester Hemingway, and an array of other people as well. He looked at the ocean, and he thought to himself that the high seas were a kind of commons, were a kind of space open for colonization, and that he and his backers could set up shop. So they found two reefs, two atolls in the Southwest Pacific, the Minerva Reefs, in between the island archipelago of Fiji and Tonga. And so Fiji and Tonga here, Australia here, New Zealand here. The reefs are kind of in this area. And they hired a dredging vessel. They dredged up sand out of the lagoon, piled sand on top of the reef, and began to pour concrete. And they wanted to basically build a platform that would create a city that would eventually house up to 30,000 people. And it would be built along these market principles that I mentioned earlier. This didn't go well for a variety of reasons. You can imagine that the Kingdom of Tonga was not excited by this, neither was the Kingdom of Fiji. And there was an array of other issues as well that have been things that have dogged these kinds of efforts, labor costs in particular, but also engineering issues and the like. That project collapsed in the early 1970s. Oliver then pursued two other projects, and I want to give you a sense of these projects because I explored them in sort of abundant detail in the book. I'm a very detail-oriented person. And a lot of the stuff I have comes from files that people haven't used before, from British Special Branch spies, basically, and from the FBI, from freedom of information act requests that I had. I had CIA FOIA requests that have been outstanding for 8 years now. I still haven't fulfilled my requests, but anyways, I doubt they will. So the second project that Oliver took up was in the Bahamas, on the islands of Abaco in the Bahamas. And here he did something very interesting, which is he ended up allying himself with some individuals that you would be surprised that he might ally himself with. These included ex-OSS officials and people who had a kind of tangential relationship with the CIA. This would include E. Howard Hunt, who was involved in the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. He was a CIA officer. Hunt was also famously a Watergate plumber when Nixon They broke into the DNC headquarters in Watergate. E. Howard Hunt went to prison for that. So Hunt was involved, and another man by the name of Mitchell Livingston Werble III. I could talk forever about Werble. I won't, but Werble ran a kind of mercenary training compound in the outskirts of Atlanta, in Powder Springs, Georgia. Had also served in the OSS in Southeast Asia with E. Howard Hunt. Werble was most famous for making sound suppressors, silencers, which were illegal for a long period of time. But he made sound suppressors, and the most famous one he made was for what was known as the deadliest pistol in human history, which was the Ingram MAC-10, the MAC-10 MAC-10, made by Gordon Ingram. It fired 70 rounds a minute or something like this. Super deadly machine gun pistol. If you've seen 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford, that's what Max von Sydow is carrying in the film. If you've watched The Wire, they reference the MAC-10 multiple times in the show The Wire. It's all over Hollywood, right? The MAC-10 with Werble's silencer. So these are the people that Oliver ends up, in some sense or another, allying himself with, and they attempt to invade a portion of the Bahamas in 1973. And then what they're doing is they're attempting to foment a secessionist rebellion in the Bahamas. And so the Bahamas is slated to become independent and is going to become a predominantly black government. And the islands of Abaco are predominantly white. They don't want to be ruled by a black government. They want to stay part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom says no way, right? It's Bahama independence, part of the Bahamas. And so then they're going to attempt to secede instead. And the idea here is if they ally with Werble and Oliver and some of these other characters, what they can do is set up a kind of independent, largely market-driven, brand new nation state along these kinds of principles. And they had a whole series of things that I won't go into detail set up about how land would be divided up and how income would be processed and so on. That also fell apart. The FBI got involved. Werble was in trouble and had to go in front of the Congress, and so an array of things happened. But that fell apart. And so Oliver was very persistent and made one last kind of effort here. Everywhere he goes in this process, by the way, he's leaving enormous amounts of political devastation in his wake. And this is part of the thing that's very important. These are not wacky experiments, which is the way they're often narrated. They're kind of silly, they're kind of funny, they're sort of blips on the radar of history. And I don't see them that way. I mean, there's pretty serious consequences to the projects that he's involved in. The last project is in the New Hebrides. This is back in the Southwest Pacific, part of what's known as Melanesia, so near the Solomon Islands, north of Australia. Now the archipelago of Vanuatu is called Vanuatu now, but it was called the New Hebrides. It was colonized by the French and the British, and as with many other places in Oceania in the 1970s, it was decolonized. And it was clear that independence was coming. The British were absolutely wanted to get out of the sort of business of colonization. They managed to sort of set up the Sterling area, which helped them sort of revamp their empire through a certain kind of monetary form of imperialism, offshore, in other words. And the French were kind of slowly, as long as they could keep New Caledonia, where their investments in nickel were very important, they were slowly sort of pulling out as well. So Oliver and a group of backers then went there. They formed what was called the Phoenix Foundation, and they got involved in a couple of different secessionist movements around the globe, one on the Azores, the island of the Azores, part of Portugal. But the one in Vanuatu, the New Hebrides, was the most important. And they allied themselves with the secessionist movement there in the northern islands of Vanuatu. They helped foment a rebellion. The rebellion is called the Santo Rebellion in 1980, and it ended up with death, displacement of a couple of thousand native Vanuatu people. Oliver ended up being banned permanently from the archipelago, and it had a kind of medium-term disastrous effect on the archipelago and its post-colonial life. If you go back, I've been to Vanuatu to do research, and he's still, his name, people all recognize his name. They all remember Michael Oliver. Some of them find him. Some of them still want to see him kind of return. And he's 94. He's still alive. I've spoken to him a couple of times on the phone. And he's still kind of remembered in very mixed ways in Vanuatu, which speaks to the sort of complexity of how these things are formed. So I looked at those projects, and then I look at two contemporary projects that you might be familiar with. One is seasteading. This is the practice that is financed by Peter Thiel, the famous Silicon Valley iconoclast, backer of Trump, owns Palantir, founder of PayPal. And then the director of the Seasteading Institute when it first started was Patrick Friedman, Milton Friedman's grandson, a famed neoliberal economist, kind of free market guru. So Patrick Friedman, the grandson, was the early director of the Seasteading Institute. It was founded in 2008. The idea was to set up private, sovereign, floating platforms on the open ocean. And so you go back to the sort of early Oliver project that I was talking about earlier. They've run into a lot of problems. One is that the legal status of the ocean is not as clear as they like to think it is. And there's a lot of claims made about the open ocean, the high seas, it's a commons, you can do this, you can do that. It's really legally actually much more complicated than that. Then there's engineering problems, right? It can't be a fixed platform. It's too deep, and that also raises legal problems if it's fixed rather than floating. But then how do you keep it floating and deal with all of the sort of technicalities of water? And then they've got labor costs. Right? So labor costs are extravagant. When you're that far away, to be in the open ocean, so-called high seas, you have to be a long way from land, and that means labor costs are pretty significant. So seasteading continues. In 2017, the seasteaders had a memorandum of understanding with the government of Tahiti. Tahiti is still part of France. It's a kind of autonomous territory, but it's still part of France. They negotiated an MOU, and they were going to put a fixed platform in a lagoon off the coast of Tahiti. That made many of the islanders unhappy. The MOU was allowed to die, and that project has not gone forward. And now the seasteaders are doing stuff around Panama, off the Atlantic coast of Panama. Mostly like little pod developments. Anyways, they've had to scale back their plans quite a bit, which is a common refrain you'll hear with these kinds of projects. Very aspirational, then they end up getting walked back, and they end up starting to look like timeshares, basically. And then the other project that I look at is free private cities in Honduras. These are ongoing. It started off as charter cities. Charter cities, the idea behind charter cities was a little bit like charter schools, but again, sort of ratcheted up theoretically. But the idea behind charter cities was that a group of international investors or governments would take control of a certain portion of land ceded to them by another government. So let's just take the case of Honduras for a second. Honduras would actually cede, let's say, 750 acres of land or hectares of land, and to a group of international investors and builders. They would build a city there. It would be an opt-in, opt-out city. You could come and go as you pleased, in theory. I mean, the idea that there would be absolutely no migratory controls was a myth. That even the sort of biggest boosters for this were clear that there would have to be migratory controls. But the key to this was that 750 hectares would be, the Honduran Constitution would not apply. That this would be land essentially ceded, whether in usufruct for 99 years, sort of leasehold, or for longer. But the premise would be that this would be actual territory that would be given up by the country in question. Very controversial, as you can imagine. It gets even more controversial because the charter cities then gets translated into something more akin to the kind of things I looked at, which is free private cities. These are not opt-in, opt-out. These are buy-in. So you have to be wealthy and you have to have the money to buy into these. They will be gated, they will be exclusive and exclusionary, and they will still at the same time be on land that effectively where, in the case of Honduras, they're saying now 3 out of 247 articles of the Honduran Constitution would apply. If it were to go to a vote and the Honduran populace were to vote against these, that vote would not be binding. Right? So it actually strips away an enormous amount of the sort of democratic politics for the people of Honduras. This happening, mind you, at the same time that huge numbers of working poor and middle-class Hondurans are having to flee the country because of the coup d'etat in 2009 and how violent and how repressive and how awful it's been. So you have Hondurans themselves who are being displaced and made stateless, people with no rights, while tech bros and former Reagan officials are in fact setting up areas where they're going to have extraterritorial rights, sort of doubling down on this. It's really appalling in my view. So those are the things I look at. The chapters cover that kind of stuff. I'll just finish up here by saying just a couple of things. One is the aims of the book. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was take these projects seriously and say that they're not a joke. That we shouldn't be laughing at them. We shouldn't be sort of, Monty Python skit. They're actually, they should be taken pretty seriously. They tell us a lot about the 60s and 70s, and they tell us a lot about what's happening now as well. The current tech-utopian projects that are around us are not new. There's nothing new here. So looking at the earlier projects can actually reveal to us the sort of consequences that we might expect if these kinds of tech-utopian projects actually start to really get some pull in places. We've already seen this a little bit in Honduras. My last aim in the book was also to spend a lot of time looking very closely at the social histories of the places where these happen. So a lot of writing about tech-utopian projects, the seasteaders, private cities, all this kind of stuff, spends a lot of time on those guys and spends very little time on the people of Vanuatu, the people of the Bahamas, the people of Honduras, the people of Tahiti. It's as if they're just another blank slate again. It's super problematic and the kind of thing that, as a historian at least, and as a historian I'm not a historian of the United States, I'm a historian of Latin America, is all too common, unfortunately, in which the places where these projects unfold, people don't pay attention to the social histories of those places. And the fact that there's resistance, but there's also people allying themselves with some of these characters, and the like. And then the last concluding thoughts, one is I want to stress just the continuities between the earlier projects and the current projects. Things like dispossession, colonization, class warfare. These are heavily racialized projects. It's not coincidental that the kind of colonizers are looking in particular places around the globe at particular points in time, right? It's a sort of class, but also heavily racialized. There's also differences, right? There's continuities between these old projects and the new ones. There's also differences. Michael Oliver, I'm not a fan of his projects, and I'm a strong critic in the book of these projects, but I have a sense of what drove him. Right? And what drove him was what happened to him in his life, and what was done to his family. It's horrific. And the totalitarianism that he feared, right? It was just intensely visceral for him, as you can imagine. The tech-utopians are different. They are much more Nietzschean, I would say, than Oliver was. And what I mean by this is that there's a sense in which they can bend reality to their will. There's an arrogance in the tech-utopians that I think is worrisome. And when I say bend reality to their will, part of what they want to do is not just create these kind of new private states, but they want these private states and new legal systems that they're going to produce for those states to rebound back onto existing nation states in a way that's going to force existing nation states to further deregulate, to further privatize, right, to further loosen up regulation and so on and so forth. The idea is to actually have a kind of echo effect, or a rebound. I find that worrisome. State capture. So it's not just about privatization. It's also like if you've been following, Blake Masters in the Arizona, right, running for the Senate in Arizona, the Republican candidate there, who wrote a book with Peter Thiel. Masters has been very clear about this, but I think Bannon and others have as well. They're not just about getting rid of the state. They want to privatize it, right? And what I mean by that is they don't want to turn everything that the state does into private, into a kind of private operation or out to sort of private industry, but they see the state itself as a new place of economic capture. And I think there's a little bit of a difference there. They're not going to dismantle the state, but the state is going to be utterly subjected to a kind of profit-making oligarchy, right? This is sort of neo-feudalism that's embedded in their project that's also part of the Silicon Valley universe. this as well, neo-reactionary politics. Last thing I'll say, the mundane, not the spectacular, is where we need to kind of focus. Jeff Bezos flying his kind of oddly shaped rocket to outer space, Elon Musk colonizing Mars. I mean, those things are great for, Love, Death, and Rockets, Love, Death, and Robots, Netflix shows and stuff. I mean, those are, sort of absurd things. But they're a distraction. I mean, because the mundane projects, the free private cities in Honduras, the efforts to create privatized communities in parts of Chile, it's been happening over the past few years, the role that libertarian think tanks have played in the overthrow of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the backing of Bolsonaro. I can go on and on. And the mundane stuff is where our attention needs to be focused, and not kind of distracted by outer space sci-fi, transferring your consciousness into computer code and this kind of stuff. As interesting as all that may be. And then the last thing is Earth's first class passengers. In honor of Mike Davis, who you probably know is passing away. He calls them Earth's first class passengers and says that the only way, right, to deal with the reality of climate change and the sort of class dimension of climate change is to ensure that Earth's first class passengers do not have preferential exit option. And that's exactly the point that I made. So, thanks. I appreciate you listening, and I'm happy to answer questions or have conversations. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
Are you saying that when after Oliver escaped totalitarianism, that what he saw in America primarily was the civil rights movement, second wave feminism? He identified that with totalitarianism. I was wondering if you knew anything about his line of reasoning connecting those things.
Yeah. So totalitarianism was the kind of big, the big term, right, of the 50s and 60s. So, the intellectuals around Kennedy, I mean, this was their language as well, right, was totalitarianism. And it was a way, in some sense, for them to conflate communism, fascism, and socialism in the United States. So once World War II was over, right, when now it was the Soviet Union that has become the sort of, the enemy, when in fact it was the Soviet Union that effectively won World War II, if you look at just sheer numbers, right, then there was a way in which totalitarianism stood in as a kind of way to reference these other ideologies, as opposed to the sort of freedom or non-ideological ideology of the United States. And that language very quickly became a way to point towards a variety of kinds of politics that were, in all different kinds of ways, seeking something that would be called emancipation, right? In the case of Oliver, I mean, Oliver had a very couple choice phrases about this, and you can imagine, right, reading about his experience and then reading some of the things that he wrote, and just feeling enormously frustrated by this. But he talked about populations burning the inner city and using stormtrooper tactics. He talked about sort of quote unquote white liberals and soul brother forgiveness. I mean, he was using coded language, right, and language that clearly pointed towards him seeing the kind of threat, right, the fear that he had of street protests, of street violence, of police unable to kind of contain, right, the sort of energies of the masses, demagoguery, and so forth. That's where he pointed, right? He didn't point to, he didn't talk about lynching, right? He didn't talk about the ongoing violence, police violence against people of color in the country. I mean, none of that comes out in his writing, and so it's a strange thing. I mean, I would have expected a kind of, I don't know, foolishly maybe, I would have thought to myself that he might have identified, right, the totalitarianism in the sort of revanchist, racist fascism in the United States, but he didn't. And I think part of that is because there was this really concerted effort to use the language of totalitarianism as a way to make it all seem the same. Communism, fascism, socialism, it's all totalitarianism, right? And of course, in the early 1980s, in the Reagan administration, that language then gets, it's that very language that corners the Reagan administration that then you end up with his ambassador to the UN, Jean Kirkpatrick, having to differentiate between certain kinds of dictatorial regimes and other kinds. So totalitarian versus, I can't remember the other term she uses, but just these two terms that she wants to use to kind of differentiate between totalitarian and authoritarian, right? And so, because the Reagan administration is negotiating and hanging out with Pinochet and so on and so forth, and so that language of totalitarianism, you know, ends up kind of boxing that administration in. But it had 4 decades in which it did a lot of work, right? I hope that answers your question.
No, that totally makes sense. I've noticed people doing similar things today. I'll run into people sometimes who seem to kind of link anything that has an ideology at all to linking it to fascism, totalitarianism, whatever blanket pejorative you want to throw it in. It tends to be emancipatory movements.
Right.
And it gets pointed out a lot.
Right.
It's just,
yeah.
Is that kind of the origin of it, or does it go back earlier than that, people using that to attack different projects?
You know, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd imagine there's a long history of sort of how all these terminologies kind of, get reworked. But certainly the case, I think of the 1950s and the 1960s in the United States was it's very sort of vivid. But you're right. I mean, I think there's very, you can see the kind of parallels today as well. I mean, there's a lot of parallels that are interesting. The sort of, the 60s was a kind of era of, enormous fear about ecological collapse, right? So the Population Bomb was a 1968 book by the Ehrlichs that was very big deal. Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons was a 1968 phenomenon. Dune was 1965, right? It's, the sort of, desert planet, ecological devastation. Soylent Green, the movie with Charlton Heston about, destroying the planet's resources, and so people are eating corpses, but they don't know it. That was based on a book that was published in the 1960s called Make Room, Make Room. There's this huge ecological sort of existential fear, and it's not unlike, the era of climate change that we're living in. It's a real fear, right? And then you also have the monetary question as well, fear of monetary collapse. So Goldfinger, James Bond Goldfinger, right? The whole premise is that the British Empire is going to collapse because of irradiated gold and the sort of issue around gold and being pegged to the dollar, and fear of money, paper money, and so all the libertarians in the 60s are already gold bugs. They're already about metal, right, and not about paper money. And now we've got cryptocurrencies, and cryptocurrencies are totally embedded in the libertarian projects in Honduras, in Puerto Rico, and elsewhere. Yeah. So there are a lot of these parallels, the sort of language and question around ideology, and also like these other things too. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
You said you talked to Oliver.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, where is he at with things now? I don't know what you talked to him about. Was it just like factual, or was it like, hey, why did you? But does he have like a retrospective perspective on? Because it seems like he had all these projects that kind of failed horribly. I don't know, what's his takeaway?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I didn't include this in the book. For a number of reasons, I guess. I mean, it took me a long time to find him. Right. So there was a mythology that was built up around Michael Oliver that I learned very quickly was seductive. I kid you not, I had people all the time sending me emails saying, I heard he was spotted in the Isle of Man. And I'm like, oh, and it took me 6 years to find him, and lo and behold, he was right where he'd always been, Carson City, Nevada. And I found him only by backtracking through. I found a reference that he'd been remarried, and then by Googling the maiden name of the woman that he married, I found a pamphlet that had her name and his name on it related to nuclear energy. So he's big into nuclear energy these days. And there was a phone number on it, and just on a whim, I called it and left a message, and he called me back. And it was dinner time, and I was like, I was sitting at the table, and we were getting ready to eat, and I just kind of went, oh my God. So it was a really unusual experience. We had a long conversation, a couple of hours, and I learned a couple of things very quickly. He was very clear that he didn't want to talk about these projects, and when I asked him why, he said because they didn't go anywhere. They failed, and that he feels like in the end the book brought him more trouble than it was worth. And the harder part of the conversation was some of the things that I just referenced are still clearly part of his worldview, which wasn't pleasant. He was cagey, and I can totally understand why. You got this academic calling you up out of the blue, and I wasn't trying to sandbag him. I mean, he called me back. I mean, I just but that's why I didn't use any of the material in the book, because it didn't feel like it didn't feel fair, right? It didn't feel like I should turn around and say, hey, can we now think of these things as interviews rather than a phone call? So I just left it all out. But he was a little cagey. Like he would say, oh, that Mitchell Werble guy, I think I met him once. And I was like, I got a lot of material that says that you may have met him more than once, right? Like, and that it's not, it's not just a kind of, coincidental passing by of one another. And so I wasn't quite sure how to, it's not about trust. It was just, there was an unreliability, right? And there was, at times his memory seemed very vivid of things, and at other times he would express, things that I felt that I could counter with documentary evidence, and then he would say, well, I'm very old and don't always remember well, and and then we talked a second time, and most of the time we talked, he really did want to talk a lot about nuclear energy and physics. He didn't really want to talk about these projects, and it was fine. It was interesting to listen to what he had to say, and so yeah, I mean, he's quite ill, and he's 94 now. His daughter called me at one point, pretty upset with me, and and again, I was trying to explain to her I wasn't somehow trying to kind of get extra information. I didn't do interviews with anybody else either, right? So I'm not going to use anything in the book, and I did an enormous amount of research, and I felt like if I'm just going to rely upon the documentary base that I have, that's what I'm going to use. And if there's gaps, there's gaps, and that's the way it goes. But I'm not going to cherry pick interviews or something like this. So yeah, it was pretty interesting to talk with him twice. Someone recently interviewed me about the book, and mentioned to me that they had spoken with him in 2007, and had a similar experience. That very very difficult to pin down when it came to the projects in the 1970s, but very absolutely sort of efflorescent when it came to talking about nuclear energy and physics and and things. So he still has a very sharp mind, and I just think he's very ambivalent about these projects, or about how they're remembered, right? Yeah. Right. And I'm critical of the projects, but I try to be fair, but kind of ruthlessly fair to him, right? I mean, I feel like I did my homework. I feel like I did a lot of work. I took this seriously. I tried to meet him halfway in terms of the evidentiary base that I have. But I also find, that there's clearly from my interpreted lens and sort of thinking about it through the perspective of, the materials and the people that I spoke with in Vanuatu and elsewhere, right, that these were extraordinarily problematic undertakings. Thanks. Yeah.
So I have two questions. The first one, just for that, is like, based on your conversation with him, did you get the sense that he was ashamed of anything that had happened, or was it not clear? Or
I think not clear is probably the best way to put it. I didn't sense ashamed. Both in the interviews that he did with Reason Magazine, he would send letters and so forth to Reason Magazine about these projects and how they were being covered in the press at various points in time. He seemed tone deaf to the critiques that were made, is the way I would put it. He just couldn't seem to kind of grasp the basis for some of the criticisms that were being leveled at him. And so it was more frustration than kind of shame. It was almost as if you just understood what it is we're doing, and that what you're suggesting here is not what's happening, and there's not a verbal Oliver organization. Okay, yeah, there's not an organization, but still, I mean, what does that, I mean, on the other hand, we do have, right, substantial evidence here of, a group of people plotting with a group of secessionists in Abaco, right, for a kind of movement. So not so much shame. I mean, the interesting thing about Oliver, too, I'll just add here, is that, I try in the book to make sure I'm constantly bringing in the other folks involved with him. Howard Schultz, who was not Howard Schultz, that's Starbucks, Harry Schultz. Same thing, really. Harry Schultz, who was a big investment specialist and did these big tax avoidance free market seminars in the Bahamas and elsewhere. Maggie Thatcher was a important supporter of Schultz's newsletter in the 1970s, and his newsletter was kind of the model for the sort of stuff that Rees-Mogg, the Brexiteers, are kind of doing now with some of their stuff. Schultz was a big supporter, an investor, and clearly was communicating with Oliver at various points in time. I don't have any letters, but it's clear that there was some kind of communication happening. And then, as I mentioned, Garvey and others. But I wanted John Hospers, who was the first person to run on the Libertarian ticket for president of the United States and was a philosophy professor at USC. I wanted to make sure that it was understood that this was a kind of movement of people, right? And it wasn't just about Oliver. But Oliver really chose to put himself out there, right? He's the one who wrote letters to Reason Magazine and did interviews with them. He's the one who went and did a long interview with People Magazine, right? There's a sort of, so in 1980, you can People Magazine, and he has this very funny quote that I include in the book where he says, I just want to help these islanders who really want to get things done, not like those lazy hippies in Berkeley. I mean, he's got these very sort of, funny, just, it's almost like the guy from Texas that ran on the independent ticket in the 80s or 90s.
Bro?
Yeah. It's got that kind of Ross Perot sort of style of speaking. So, on the one hand, I wanted to get the other parts of the movement, the other people involved. I didn't want to let them sit in the shadows. But also, Oliver was responsible for his own actions, and he really put himself out there. But anyways, to get to your original point, it didn't sound like shame to me, right? It sounded more like maybe a little bit of befuddlement at a certain point and regret about they didn't come to fruition, and I don't know, yeah.
And I guess my second question, which feels related, is like the sort of free private cities that are being built in Honduras now. Is that sort of, are those the sort of utopian projects of individuals, or are there like major corporations that we would know that are backing those things as well? It seems like that'd be something they'd be interested in.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to kind of
Figure that out.
pick apart some of this, but yeah, I guess there's a couple of things. I mean, I'm not quite sure if they're utopian projects. I think in some sense they're kind of speculative investments. Patry Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman. I mean, I'm not trying to kind of disparage the guy, but I mean, he's a venture capitalist. I mean, this is what he does, right? So he's got to come up with a new thing every couple of years to get investment money coming in. So it was seasteading, then it became free private cities or free cities incorporated or something like this. He goes and gives talks in Guatemala at the Free Market University there, Francisco Marroquin. I mean, but so that's his lifestyle, right? This is how he can afford Burning Man and all these things. The free private cities thing is, as far as I can tell, there's not a kind of, there are corporate interests, but I don't see evidence at this point yet of a sort of heavy backing.
Okay.
Cryptocurrencies are involved, and I think people who are trying to kind of get different aspects of their own sort of innovation vis-a-vis the blockchain. There is a very prominent architectural firm that's leading the one project that seems to be, in some form or another, going forward. What it's going to look like in the end, it could just be just a regular old gated community, or it could actually be, something politically and legally distinct. Is on the island of Roatan in the Bay Islands on the Atlantic side, and the architectural firm is Zaha Hadid, which is the very famous London-based architectural firm that's done a lot of the famous things in Dubai and elsewhere. And that lead architect is Patrick Schumacher. And Schumacher is an avowed anarcho-capitalist. That's how he refers to himself. He's very outspoken about his opposition to social housing and so forth. And then you have some other interesting people involved, who many of them are sort of cut their teeth in finance, international finance. Eric Bremen, who's a Venezuelan businessman and investor. Titus Gable, who's a German, same kind of story, right? And so a lot of them were influenced, I think, by Paul Romer, this economist, who's chief economist at the World Bank for a brief period of time and teaches at NYU. And he's the one who, at a TED Talk, kind of set up this idea of charter cities. And I think they've been influenced a lot by Romer, who, he won the Nobel Prize in economics for this what was called endogenous growth theory. I won't go into detail about that, but I think there's a kind of world of economic thought related to business aid finance that has shaped these projects. The Honduran regime at the time, right? They're out of power now as of November, but they were in power since 2009 through a coup. They were pretty heavily invested in these. In part, I think Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was the president most recently, all of his family had been arrested for being part of the narco-trafficking organizations. And part of the interest in these was very basic, no extradition treaty. But politics caught up to him. And so, the Honduran sort of elite have been invested in these things as well. The one place, last thing I'll say very quickly, there is a South Korean company that's been attempting to build a dry canal through Honduras. So it would be a kind of highway version of the Panama Canal, and lots of sort of warehousing and stuff like this. So you would come in, Honduras has one little access point to the Pacific, and Amapala. And Amapala was a place where they were first going to set up one of these special economic zones. And that didn't happen, but in the meantime, there's been an effort to think about facilitating a kind of transportation zone through Honduras. And that's involved this, and it's also a South Korean company that was involved in the first charter city effort in Madagascar, which preceded the Honduras one. So it's all right, kind of. Yeah. I get a little excited.
One of the things I want to ask is a little bit about the geography of the projects, because I feel that in the first 60s, 70s is really linked to the decolonization process.
Yeah.
And if you see continuations or difference between the most recent projects and you think are.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think Central America has been a long-standing, right? This is Greg Grandin's point, right? It's been an empire's workshop, right? It's a place where the U.S. and others have gone to tinker. The Honduras projects now, the Free Private Cities projects, doesn't just involve, so it's, I could list off a few people for you from California, from Silicon Valley who are involved. Michael Strong, Mackey, who owned Whole Foods, right, just down the street here, but sold it to Bezos, I think. There's a sort of, core of folks there, but then there's a whole lot of former Reaganite officials involved. So Paul Krugman, Krugman was a speechwriter for Reagan, who then went to work for Jose Piñera, right? Who wrote the labor the labor code for Pinochet, for the dictator Pinochet in Chile, and is now at the Cato Institute, that way, right, Washington, D.C. Klugman, Skousen, who comes from a very conservative Utah family, who was a investment specialist and also was a CIA agent for a while. Grover Norquist, the anti-tax pledge character who was driving a lot of sort of anti-tax politics of the 90s and the early 2000s. Faith Whittlesey, Michael Reagan, Reagan's son. There's a whole array of the ex-Reaganites who were involved in the Honduras project as well. They've sat on the board of best practices, for example. There's a board of best practices with like, I don't know, 20 people, and out of 20, like 3 of them were from Honduras. The rest were, mostly from the U.S. So this ongoing kind of neo-colonial relationship with Central America, especially with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I don't think it's coincidental that El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as a kind of national currency, which was hailed as a miraculous moment, and now, of course, is a hellish moment because of the collapse of Bitcoin. So I think that's part of it, definitely. And then the seasteaders, again, it's this ocean, right? This idea about the ocean somehow or another being open. So Thiel wrote a very famous essay for the Cato Institute I think in 2009. I think it's called How I Became a Libertarian, but he identified 3 spaces for exit, and one was cyberspace, one was outer space, and one was the ocean. And that's why he put money into the Seasteading Institute, because he felt it was the most immediate, realizable possibility, right? That cyberspace was confused in the sense that what digital exit had to offer you tangibly, right, is not clear. And this is also the case, by the way, for another very prominent exit advocate from Silicon Valley, Balaji Srinivasan, who just published a book called The Network State. And his idea is cloud first, territory second. So build digital communities of affinity, of affiliation, and then pool your money, because all of you are going to somehow or another be fairly wealthy, as he is. Find a location then where your kind of affinity group can go, settle, buy property, bring your money, and use your wealth as leverage to extract concessions from the host state, right? And so over the course of time, you can perhaps get to a free private city, but through a kind of reverse mechanism, right? So start with the cloud. His point is these don't have to be contiguous, they can be discontiguous, but then I'm not sure what happens if they're discontiguous. I don't know how again, it's the question about territoriality. There's something analog to all of the digital world, right? So there's a big digital imagination, but in the end, it's analog. There has to be some kind of territorial reality to this in order for them to, escape taxes or escape the burdens of citizenship or regulation or whatever, right? You can be part of a digital community, but if you live here, you still got the burdens of citizenship that everybody else has. So the oceans in Central America. I'm trying to think of other places where this is. There are. Quinn Slobodian has a book coming out next year that looks at a variety of these kinds of current projects that are. There's all Dubai. There's underpinnings to all of this in Dubai without necessarily the same kind of adamant ideological position. But when you look at the practice, it starts to look quite similar. Yeah.
I have a question. You kind of mentioned this a little bit when you talked about how only 3 of the constitutional pieces. So are these areas that they're trying to do this in? Is it part of the plan how they're going to bump up against the rest of the world, or is it just an escape? This is going to be this community here. We're going to do it all this way, or is part of the plan, and it's going to have this effect everywhere else?
So if I understand you correctly, I would say the latter, in the sense that I think the hope is that these would then become, there'd be iterations of these things that would take place in other places. That once, so part of this is, there's a whole industry now related to creating, say, the legal foundations for places like this. So a guy named Tom Bell, who's a law professor at Chapman University in Southern California, he has what's called ULEX. He's got some kind of technology that he's running, and he's been brought in as a consultant on many of these projects, and he's trying to essentially create a platform where you can generate combinations of common law and civil law, and sort of create forms of law that would apply to these places that would look quite different than the sort of traditional way in which we think about law in a nation-state sovereign environment. In the case of Honduras, I mean, the operating idea is that these would be, as much as feasibly possible, distinct from any kind of oversight from Honduras, right? And so that they would have as much latitude legally, in terms of police, in terms of labor regulations, and so on and so forth, as they could possibly have. So it's a kind of nostalgic vision of Hong Kong that just gets put on steroids, I mean, in some sense, right? That it would really have a kind of contractual underpinning, and this is the sort of language is exactly that it's a contract, and so you don't have any votes if you live there, right? So let's say that theoretically one of these places comes into being, and you decide that you want to go there, you won't have a vote. There won't be any kind of representative politics or something like this. You'll sign a contract, and you abide by the contract. And the contract is essentially written and overseen by the sort of primary investors or the primary sort of oversight committee that's been put together that negotiated with the Honduran government in the first place. There's a lot of outstanding questions about how much or how little of the Honduran Constitution would apply. The Honduran Constitution itself has been changed to accommodate these, and it was changed under very fraught circumstances in the wake of the coup. There were Supreme Court justices who were forcibly removed from their position because they opposed the creation of these, and they were replaced with loyalists who then approved it. And there was also a lot of infighting. There was an array of people early on the ground there trying to set some of these up on the mainland, and they were jockeying with each other for position and doing a lot of backroom wheeling and dealing. And Paul Romer pulled out and had quite harsh words about what was happening, and he said, I'd never want my grandchild to grow up in one of these places. I can't believe this. This is corrupt. This is not what I had in mind. A lot of the other people that I look at, stayed. I mean, they were part of this backroom wheeling and dealing. But I think the premise is that the idea of it itself then becomes a product to be sold. Right? The legal systems that Tom Bell puts together becomes a product to be sold. The parameters by which you put together arbitration boards and put together a set of documents about how arbitration boards are going to work. The Roatan, just to give you an example of how ridiculous this looks, the arbitration board for Roatan Prospera, this 58-acre private city on Roatan that's being built, the arbitration board is 3 white men from Arizona. All 3 of them conservative Supreme Court justices that have all retired. Right? And so there's a kind of connection also with, again, going back to the sort of examples from the 1960s, there's a real connection with sort of the extreme sort of property rights conservatives that make up a part of the Republican Party in the United States now. I mean, the Democrats do, but especially the Republicans here. There's a representative from Mississippi, Joel Baumgar, who's anti-choice, all of the sort of standard conservative Republican lines, but is again self-professed libertarian, which is like hard to square that. But he's another member of the sort of board of best practices, right? Heavily male, heavily male, which is a classic libertarian thing as well in the United States. Although that's changing, I should add. I went to one of these groups called the Startup Societies Foundation, which is a little bit like the Anarcho-Pulco group in the HBO series. They had a big conference in San Francisco in 2017, and I went to it for 4 days to kind of listen in, and I would say it was probably 40% female. I was really surprised. I expected it to be totally the caricature of sort of young teenage boys, reading Atlas Shrugged, and it wasn't. There was a lot of women.
I have another question.
Sure.
So you said that Oliver was fomenting a revolution, and what was the name of the country?
Vanuatu, yeah, the New
Vanuatu.
Hebrides, yeah.
How did he go about fomenting a revolution?
Yeah. So I didn't go into a lot of detail about this. It's probably the densest chapter in the book, and in part because when I went to Vanuatu, so just a quick backstory on this, and I'm sorry if this is too much information, but as Britain was sort of basically leaving various places, it was trying to figure out what to do with the civil servants, all these colonial civil servants who had been lifelong bureaucrats, career bureaucrats. And so they kind of, as for example, as Africa, as the countries in Africa were decolonizing and the British were leaving, a lot of these bureaucrats would then go off to other places that were still colonial holdings that were in the process of decolonization. So one of these individuals was a career bureaucrat by the name of Gordon Haynes, and he was part of Special Branch, so he was effectively a kind of spy, He was a sort of part of the colonial apparatus that was attached to embassies, but he was a sort of he was a kind of investigator and worker, And he ended up in Vanuatu in 1970, and he stayed in Vanuatu for a long time. And then when he died, his records, his files, and documents were embargoed until 2015. And the reason I went to Vanuatu in part was because I was given access to his materials. And it's incredible. It's one giant box of stuff. All of it is him tracking American speculators in Vanuatu. All of it. Eugene Peacock, who was a Hawaii-based real estate speculator, Michael Oliver, and then smaller groups around them. And that's essentially, it's clear, that's what he had been sent to Vanuatu to do, was to track American speculators. And Hawaii was a launching off point for many of them. And the British and the French don't like each other, but they can definitely agree on the fact that they don't like Americans. And so they allied, essentially, to kind of stop American investment in land speculation and land divisions. And so Haynes is there. And if you go through Haynes's files and you realize that he's tracking Oliver, Oliver and Peacock and others, what they were doing was taking advantage of an internal, I don't want to say a conflict, but an internal difference that was opening up in Vanuatu. So because it was colonized by the French and the British, the northern portion of the archipelago is mostly Francophone, and the center and southern portion of the archipelago is mostly Anglophone. The Anglophone anti-colonial movement was driven by intellectuals who were part of the Anglican Church. So Walter Linney, Barack Sope. Linney became the first prime minister of Vanuatu after independence. But these were Anglophone and sort of somewhat cosmopolitan intellectuals. They went to Tanzania in 1974. They were in communication with the Black Power movement in the United States. I mean, Black Power activists went to Vanuatu. They were eventually banned from Australia, Angela Davis and others. And so you have that anti-colonial group, and then you have a Francophone anti-colonial group, which are people from the bush. They're not cosmopolitan. Most of them speak a kind of pidgin, and their concerns are really about encroachment on land on the islands in which they live, and they want the return of land that had been taken away from them mostly by French colonists. Those two anti-colonial movements start to, they don't fight with each other, but they initially you would think they would be kind of allies because they're anti-colonial, but they start to diverge. And one of the leaders of the Francophone movement, a guy named Jimmy Stevens, a chief, he has a large ego. He feels empowered, right? He's he's becoming a kind of larger-than-life figure in many respects. And, you know, he allies himself with Oliver. I mean, he uses Oliver to his own ends, right? He's not a dupe. I think that's very important. He's no more, let's put it this way, he's naive, but he's no more naive than Michael Oliver and, you know, his backers, right? And so he allies himself, Jimmy Stevens allies his movement, his anti-colonial movement, with these libertarians. And so they are essentially giving him radio equipment, a little ship, some weaponry, money. They mint gold coins with Jimmy Stevens' head on them, and it says individual rights for all, right? So it's got all this kind of libertarian paraphernalia on the coin, right? Because Oliver's a coin dealer and maker. You can go onto eBay and find these for sale every once in a while. And Stevens and his movement, the Francophone movement, are at a certain point they want to secede because they feel, in some sense, that they don't want to come under the thumb of the Anglophone intellectual class, and that they can set up a different kind of post-colonial polity, post-colonial world than just a kind of nation state that takes the colonial structure, right, this archipelago of 83 islands, and just turns it into. And instead, you know, Stevens says that's a colonial artifact, right? We could actually make a confederation, we could actually separate. And he's not wrong, right? A lot of these were experiments that were undertaken in parts of Africa and elsewhere, and he's not wrong about that. But to achieve it, he allied himself with, you know, with a group of people that were naive, problematic, and were being tracked quite closely. And so that's how that happened. And he kind of declared independence. Stevens just kind of declared independence in 1980 for the Northern Islands, and there was a lot of resistance on the Northern Islands too. Not everybody backed Stevens, and so he just declared it outright, and there was this rebellion, and it lasted about 2.5 months. Troops from Papua New Guinea had to be brought in to ultimately, you know, quell the rebellion. You know, the Libertarians went home, the French went home, the British went home. Jimmy Stevens went to prison for 14 years. His closest allies were sent to prison, two of whom died in prison. I mean, it's a tragic story in many respects. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you. So two questions potentially related. One, I wonder if you could say more about the relationship between these speculative investments, etc., with local populations. I mean, what are the labor relations like? And
right.
you know, thinking back to things like United Fruit Company, where there was a very obvious connection in terms of commodity chains, etc., as to what the way in which local populations were being incorporated into this kind of global cycle. And kind of related to that, is anybody making money here? Like, is there? Because it seems like there's a lot of money going in
right.
that's very recklessly being spent in very speculative ways. But are people getting rich here? And if
right.
so, how? And if not, then what is fueling the kind of cycle of these types of utopian projects?
Yeah, thanks. Both are great questions. I'll start with the labor question. You know, I think I mentioned for the seasteaders, the labor question is the big one, right? And they're very upfront about these things. I mean, one of the nice things about these movements is that they're just, you know, they're all online and they're totally transparent. So all their PDFs and everything, you can just access them and read them. And so they talk a lot about labor. They're very aware that they've got a labor issue, right? That it's so expensive. And it's interesting because, you know, Jules Verne, you know, who was so forward-thinking when he was writing in the 1880s and 1890s, he has a very a less well-known book called The Self-Propelled Island. And it's essentially this. I mean, it's an island, it's an artificial island populated only by bickering billionaires. And it trolls around the Pacific. And, you know, Verne wrote a lot of his books as geography primers. That's why he gives you longitude and latitude and stuff. And so this one was his Pacific Island geography primer that he was paid to write, and he turned it into an adventure story. And so, you know, they have the same issue on this island, right? They have to import the labor, but they have sundown laws. They're not allowed to stay after sundown, and so then they have to kick the labor off and everything. So the seasteaders have confronted that. The Honduran project, this was something they'd become more attentive to. So initially, they didn't talk much about labor at all. And then they realized that it didn't look good, and now they talk more about how they're creating local jobs, that they're going to have a certain pay scale, a certain kind of living wage or minimum wage for local labor and so forth. They've gotten to the point now where they're hinting that they're going to have some housing that might even be, affordable, right? Affordable. I think it's still in the $120,000 range or something like this for a single-family dwelling, which is just, I mean, it's difficult here, let alone for someone in Honduras. But they have made these overtures. How successful they've been at attracting local labor is not entirely clear to me. I'm not sure who's doing. They are building. You can see online that they're doing some building, but it's not clear to me who's doing that building. The labor in other instances in Michael Oliver's projects. So this is a question that doesn't really come up for Michael Oliver or for the people that he's working with. They hire, in the case of the reefs, they hire a dredging firm, and they do have a small crew of people who come from the U.S. and see themselves as the sort of first wave of settlers who bring both a construction crew with them, and they themselves have skills. This included, by the way, the cast of characters is quite interesting. This included a guy by the name of Tad Weed. Tad Weed was the place kicker for the Ohio State University football team when it was undefeated in 1954, and went on to create the Weed tennis racket, very famous big head tennis racket from the 1970s. And that's how he made his money, was with the Weed tennis racket. It was based in Ohio. And he was one of these first settlers who started they would pour the concrete and they would encapsulate coral from the reef in chicken wire, and then pour concrete to make the foundation. But he doesn't talk a lot about labor. And then the one point that he does talk about labor explicitly, it's quite awful. Jimmy Stevens and Oliver, along with actually Colby, one of the former directors of the CIA, had a scheme in the late 1970s in which they wanted to bring South Vietnamese boat people to Vanuatu, and effectively they were going to have them as indentured servitude. And so the idea was that they would bring South Vietnamese refugees to Santo, the main island, the biggest island and the most economically important island, and that they would be housed and fed but not paid to work the land. And the Vietnamese American lobby in the United States went to Congress and argued vehemently against this. And they accused the director at the time, her name was Jackie Bong Wright. She accused, in no uncertain terms, Michael Oliver of effectively attempting to enslave South Vietnamese refugees. That's the term she used. She said they will be Michael Oliver's slave labor. It's quite extraordinary. And that's one of the few times that they talk about labor at all. Right? The money question. This is something that I didn't talk about very much at all. So they created a corporation, the Vanguard Corporation, which was intended to sort of oversee how the instituting of the Constitution would take place. And there was, some interesting people on that board. I won't go into detail about that. But you had they made money a little bit. Michael Oliver ended up losing a lot of money in the end. But they made money a little bit because what they did was give you two ways to participate in the project. One was to be a settler. And so you would buy a plot of land in advance, outright, and then you would go and you would agree to go and settle there and sort of help create the community, the individualized community. And you would buy at a kind of discounted rate because you would agree to be a settler. The other way you could participate in the project was to invest simply as a kind of speculative investment and not be a settler, and you would pay more, something like $3,000 or something like this for a share. So the idea was to buy shares. They did the same thing with the project in Vanuatu. They created what was called the Vemerana Corporation, and they issued actually there's a whole pamphlet, the originals at the University of Hawaii in their collections. They have a whole sheet that lays out the sort of investment structure, like how many shares you can get, what size acre you get for each share, land quality, all this kind of stuff. And so that's the way that, in theory, right, people would make money. The assumption would be that you would invest, and that if these things were successful, land value would go up, right, and you would be able to reap the reward on your investment that way. No one made much money, as far as I know. There were the few people who did. Harry Schultz, who I mentioned before, he was able to, use these projects to build his mailing list and attract more and more people to. He would go to Freeport in Grand Bahama, right? And Freeport is an excellent example of this kind of stuff. He would bring people to Freeport for these investment strategy seminars that would run for 3 days. He actually brought a group of the islanders from Santo in Vanuatu to Freeport for one of these. He made a lot of money.
Was it like a Ponzi scheme then at some point?
These are a little, they're a little Ponzi-ish, absolutely. I mean, I think in both of these, both the 70s projects and the contemporary projects, I think you really do have true believers. And I think Michael Oliver really was one. He's the one who uses the language of the moral experiment. That's his terminology. And then I think you also totally have grifters left and right. One of the humorous things about the file of Gordon Haynes, the special branch officer in Vanuatu, was his awareness of just how much grift was going on, and the number of people that he interviewed, and then he would write up his interview notes. The number of people he interviewed who had been arrested repeatedly in California and Hawaii for fraud, and now had made their way to Vanuatu. There was just a kind of circuit, right, that they were following. And they were arrested for other things too. And there was at one point where I was struggling about whether or not to include a very humorous, but also, problematic story about what somebody had been arrested for. And ultimately I didn't include it because these were these private files, and it felt gratuitous to include it. But there were so many cases of people who had been arrested for fraud in various kinds of ways, and then ended up in Vanuatu in these files. So I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. And the contemporary projects are the same. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Please.
In your book, you mention one of the three sort of pillars of modern U.S. libertarianism being anti-communism.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that with the Red Scare, and I guess a sub-question inside this, to what degree, if any, in the latest wave does individualist anarchism, like Stirner, Tucker,
Right.
Rothbard, influence this project, if at all?
So Rothbard hated these projects, right? Rothbard wrote repeatedly negative things about Michael Oliver, and at one point he said, I'm fed up with these new country utopians, these Minervians, these Abaconians. He singled out Oliver's project and gave it a noun, or something, and said, they need to come back and fight in the here and now. And Rothbard actually even went and spent. There's another figure who I don't spend a lot of time talking about, but had a very similar trajectory to Oliver, is a guy by the name of Werner Stiefel. And Stiefel's family had to flee Nazi Germany. They were also Jewish. They were dispossessed of their property and so forth, and they ended up in upstate New York. And Stiefel became a pharmaceutical engineer, and he bought a motel off of I-87, the Socrates Motel, and turned it into a place where they were going to build a ship and sail it to the Bahamas and turn it into a private country on the ocean. And he invited Rothbard to come speak. They would have these gatherings. Another person that went to speak there was Erwin Strauss, who wrote a famous book called How to Start Your Own Country. And so you have these various characters like this. The anti-communism you know, it's pervasive. And I think, you know, the interesting thing, of course, is the sort of totalitarian side of this, right? It's the sort of language of totalitarianism. But the anti-communist side of it, I mean, the way it comes into play is, in some sense, I mean, it's clearly embedded in the projects, but it's also what's the best way to put this? It sits behind efforts to sort of generate support for these projects by creating fear, right? By creating, you know, so the Abaco project, both the residents of Abaco, but also Michael Oliver, Werbel, all of the sort of OSS, CIA affiliated people, all of them accuse Pendling, who's going to become the first prime minister of the independent Bahamas, and his political party, which is entirely black. They accuse them of all being part of a red internationalism. So essentially, they're scared of black nationalism and red internationalism, right? Is essentially, you know, it's kind of weird. It's the blacks and the reds, right? That they're kind of targeting, right? The way they put it. Ian Fleming actually is, you know, pretty awful on this front. He accused the NAACP of being a communist front. He had terrible racial politics. He had, you know, and his political politics weren't much better. Similar kinds of things. I mean, if you read Fleming's novels and short stories, he's got a couple of short stories that they were turned into movies, like For Your Eyes Only, and they started off as short stories, and the movies have nothing to do with the short story. But the short stories, a lot of them are about concerns about the Cuban Revolution and what's going to happen to property owners in Cuba, and whether or not they're going to show up in Jamaica, and what's going to happen to the relationship between the mob and landowner, you know, and so what's going to happen to property owners in Jamaica if the mob, you know, it's like, but it's all embedded in a kind of anti-communist rhetoric and politics and so forth. The same with Vanuatu. The fear and sort of idea about communism is used as a way to kind of stoke investment in Vanuatu. And so Eugene Peacock and Michael Oliver, part of their sales pitch for investment in their schemes in Vanuatu are pitches made to soldiers, U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, who have romantic relationships or marriages or children with Vietnamese women who fear staying in Vietnam if the South falls, right? And so they sort of mobilize this very strong sort of language about what's going to happen to them, and again, filled with lots of anti-communist kind of sentiment, but also that they can't go back to the United States if they have a partner or a wife or a child that's Vietnamese because of the politics in the United States and how they'll be treated. And so instead, they should invest in Vanuatu. It's very manipulative, very instrumentalized. Yeah, it's pretty awful. So anyway, in all of these projects, right, the kind of pervasive anti-communist sort of milieu of the era is there. And the contemporary projects, yeah, I mean, the language that's constantly being used. I mean, I'm amazed. I never thought in my lifetime I would see like a communist be hurled as an accusation at somebody in the United States. I was like, oh my God, where did that come from? But again, I mean, the Silicon Valley crowd is, you know, totally part of this language. I mean, totally part of this language. I mean, they're sort of mobilizing the language of, you know, communist red scare tactics and so forth in a pretty direct way. Right? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. I guess this is probably out of time, but I appreciate very much the questions and the spirit of the questions and the conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it was great.